The question is, how can we, as multiple stakeholders, public, private, NGO, advance thinking about how we rebuild cities, either rebuild or build cities from scratch, to build in resilience, adaptation, social value, and inclusion into the reconstruction efforts? What is the role, ideally, of the private sector in all of these conversations?
Thanks, Alex. So let's start with some of the key imperatives for our future cities, right? So we've got affordability, safety, and sustainable solutions. Now, in the first part, I think we have to, when we think of rebuild, work towards that 15-minute city principle, which is within 15 minutes, the average citizen could access all fundamental necessities, including social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, mass transit. And then you actually densify, and from the densification, you have the safety, you have the affordability, and then you have that vibrant economy. On the sustainability front, the big elephant in the room is not the quality of the new construction, but really the emissions of our ongoing construction works. And the fact is that we've got more greenhouse gases embedded in all of our existing buildings that we should never be emitting again. So the question of actually demolishing everything and rebuilding is just out of the question. So what do? We've got to persevere as the private sector on our circular construction industry. The 3 R's: recycle, reuse, repurpose. Now the first two are today just highly inefficient, very expensive, and some of the materials actually, frankly, are, the quality is quite suspect. So if you look at repurpose existing spaces, whether it's commercial to residential, industrial to mixed use. In fact, we're very proud of a development we've done in the canton of Zurich, in Bülach, where we've repurposed an industrial zone into a township with mixed use. The principle being that repurposing existing capacity would give the existing concrete, et cetera, a new lease on life. But the fundamental challenge is going to be to bring the private sector in this to innovate, and in the long run, make this circularity sustainable, right? So, you have to actually have pushed profit into this. If in the short run it's grants, it's area bonuses, whatever it takes, because the private sector needs to do what it does best, right? And the innovation is really just fundamental. From a city perspective, we also have to have those set standards. We have to have those codes. We have to calculate net zero, actually holistically. I mean, give you an example. A top certified LEED building could fail a sustainability test if you actually built into it or calculated the structure that was torn down, that it replaced, or the emissions during construction. So once you actually create these standards holistically and have them apply with clarity, that actually flows through the economy, and that cost gets appropriately allocated. There is that other bigger elephant in the room, which is how do we pay for this? And leading up to 2050, setting our net zero standards, we're looking at anywhere between a $2 to $6 trillion cost on an annual basis. Staggering number. Industrialized nations, developing countries, we all know the answer as to who should be bearing the cost of that. COP27, great, but they, I think, fell short with that 100 billion damages fund, which is a drop in the ocean relative to this cost. And the reason I bring this up as part of a cities rebuild discussion is that if we are pushing our local communities, our companies to innovate, but capital is global, competition is global, and you don't have parity, how is this sustainable, right? So I'll end by saying that when you consider cities rebuild, infrastructure and building design needs to be sustainable. The construction needs to be sustainable, and then obviously the infrastructure through its life cycle also needs to be resilient. And I'll give you an example of India, where upgrading in all of our Indian cities are underground metro networks. It's an incredible investment, and that, yes, it decongests city centers and it reduces pollution, but fundamentally in the face of climate impacts, whether it's floods, monsoon, earthquakes, terrorist attacks, you actually have infrastructure that is resilient, and the city and our mega cities don't come to a standstill.
You perfectly just set up Mark by saying, how do we pay for it? One last question for Arjun. How do you think, you've worked in so many different countries and cities, how do you assess sustainability of a city writ large if you look across, for example, a large country, take India, for example?
There's a lot of complaints these days of noise and dust. And it's a major health concern in many cities around the world, especially in India. And it's a tough problem to tackle, at least in the short term. I mean, India, for example, is dealing with the kind of urban migration that is unprecedented. 300 million Indians, which is nearly the size of the United States population, is actually migrating to urban centers in the next 25, 30 years, which is something that happened in Europe over centuries. Cities are that 70+% GDP generator. They're also the generator of the emissions and waste. And how do you actually meet the aspirations of all these Indians that are actually moving to these urban centers, right? So the question is, at least for us, and Maimuna covered this, and is not a question of whether we can afford not to rebuild. We have to rebuild. How do you do it sustainably? How do you do it, to ensure the quality of life is very high? Now, we talked about the 15-minute city principle. But what a lot of our Indian cities are doing today is we're upgrading substantially, for example, our underground metro networks, right? And connecting our mega cities. And the mega cities now, I define them as anything with 10, 15, 20, 25 million, populations. We're connecting them with satellite towns, with suburbia, so that you actually reduce the congestion in the city. And look, Japan did this beautifully in the 60s, all the way back in 1964 with Tokyo, with high-speed rail. And so India's following suit now. And what that does is improve affordability tremendously, quality of life tremendously for those that can actually commute into the major city centers where the major economies, at least today, are in the Indian cities. Another example, if you take the city of Mumbai, which is a coastal city, linear, limited landmass. We're now actually ringing the city with infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, so that, again, we can achieve that same purpose and actually access the incremental rings of development that are taking place outside of our urban centers. But I think what's fundamentally important in achieving this urban transformation, right, is local governance, local budgetary decision-making authority, the fourth P, participation of the community, which, by the way, we're sitting in a country that actually celebrates that. It's actually, frankly, in some of Indian towns and cities absent, where state agencies are still actually taking decisions, for local and city communities. I mean, the mayor, for example, in Mumbai is a ceremonial role, right? So that's something that I think needs to get addressed. One last point, I think, which is just so fundamentally important: how can we have pride if our cities are not clean? And India actually neglected this for decades until actually in the last 10 years, in fact, it was our Prime Minister that took this personally as a goal, and it's made a tremendous difference in terms of the pride and ownership of where we live today.
Thank you. Julia Hobsbawm from the Nowhere Office project that looks long-term at the future of work, and I write the Working Assumptions column for Bloomberg, and it's a question specifically for Mr. Dewan, actually, which is, isn't the 15-minute city idea in relation to the central business district quite compromised post-COVID, and isn't there a tension between the desire for sustainability and for less of a commute? So my question is, are you pricing in quite a shift in the design and modelling of the central business district? And is that perhaps why you're investing in high-speed Mumbai trains to get out to the suburbs as well?
Thank you. Actually, the question would probably be more relevant for Mark because Indians are now all back to work. So post-COVID, this is a cultural. There's a cultural difference in the United States and Europe and in India. And, post-COVID, everybody's back, to business as normal. As I said, our cities are overcrowded and probably bursting at the seams. So today, it's very, very hard when you actually think of our existing cities that have grown organically for decades, for those changes to happen in a matter of months or years. So, when we speak about sustainable development or that 15-minute city principle, we're talking about all the incremental developments that take place to the rings of the city as the city continues to expand. That's the urban sprawl that we're talking about that is taking, doubling and tripling the size of our cities in a span of a very short period of time. So culturally, at least in India, there's not much change. I think the goal is to decongest our, city centers, push and actually move a substantial portion of our population that's living, for example, in slums to more affordable housing that is able to then commute back into the economic center of the city.
Just because I've already run over, but could I just get one kind of final thought from each of you about that people should take away, and then I'm going to hope that the WEF could also contribute something. Circularity,
the 15-minute city, substantial private sector incentives to bridge this gap, and then finally, we start to try to live with less. We consume less. We tear down less.
Great. Thank you all very much.